is joint work between Isha and myself, and we thought we're going to be presenting some highlights from a series of ongoing research that Isha and myself has been doing, analyzing various thoughts. But mainly today, I'm going to focus on two questions. We're going to reopen this can of worms, Arab exceptionalism, with new data, I think, that will enable us to look at it in a different perspective than has been done previously. And then I'm going to segue into, asking the question of where did the revolutionaries go? I know when I said it to many of you, they said, oh, obviously they went to jail. But let's think about it a little bit more analytically. So we're going to have a little bit of a case study on Egypt, looking at the temporal dynamic of support for democracy around the Arab Spring before and after. So segueing into, this is a little bit similar to what Professor Roland showed in the morning, with the exception that the horizontal axis is, in this case, the GDP per capita in log form. The polity measure from the polity project is on the vertical axis, and it's plotting countries according to their, to how democratic / autocratic they are. The Arab countries are in blue. Out of respect, من المحبة في تونس, I actually removed it because the last measure they have for it is from before the spring. So out of respect for this lovely country, I didn't want to show an outdated number. For some reason, it was not updated. But as you can see, the argument here is, why are the Arab countries severely below their democratic peers and potential? The Arab deficit in democracy. So when it comes to the Arab democratic deficit, a lot of the work that has been done on this topic has basically been in a similar fashion to the graph I just showed you, to this graph, which is cross-country comparisons of level of democratization, trying to comprehend, are the Arab really below their democratic potential, and if so, why is that the case? And the explanations that have been presented on the table is trying to understand whether it's an Arab or Muslim effect. Is it an oil effect? Is it is it a form of the oil curse, the rentier Dutch disease sort of thing, or is it simply by virtue of being the conflict zone effect? And you can see that all of these are intertwined when it comes to the Arab world. It's very hard to separate them. So are Arab countries not democratic because of these reasons, or the many other reasons that you can think of? I mean, you can imagine looking at North Korea and saying, are Koreans, is there a Korean democratic deficit because I'm looking at North Korea? Well, there are many geopolitical reasons that can influence the outcome of how democratic a country is, right? One of the more nuanced ways to address this question is to try to evaluate the democratic values that individuals have, regardless, not going through the outcome, but to look at the democratic values that people have. Some work that has been done on this, not as prolific as the previous work on cross-country comparisons, simply because it's really hard to have an answer for this question without having the right data. Luckily, we got our hands on the World Value Survey. ماشي مقبولة منك إسحاق. We got our hands on this unique data set that basically the World Value Survey, many of you are naturally familiar with it, but the interesting thing is in the sixth wave, we have about 25, roughly 1,000 Arab respondents spanning 13 countries. Less so in the previous wave, but this with adequate representative sample, and that allows for things, for analysis that could not have been possible previously, because unlike Gallup, it has good measures of democratic aspirations. Unlike Pew, we have detailed respondent individual data, and while the Arab Barometer provides very rich data on democratic aspirations and values in the Arab world, using the World Value Survey allows us to do cross-country comparisons with non-Arab countries. So that's the exercise that we're going to be doing. I'm not going to get into too much detail about the construction. It's actually very simple, but let me start by talking about the dependent variable that we're measuring, the preference for democracy. This in itself actually is, we argue, an innovation on the literature because it enables us, because what we did is we constrained people's aspirations on democracy. Most of the measures on democracy that exist out there from these surveys are asking people, what are your democratic aspirations? How do you think your country should be democratic? And then trying to calculate the gap with another question, which is your country democratic? And naturally, everybody wants democracy, but so that's really not, not a very telling question. But when you force people to really pick between various outcomes that their country should be focused on, whether we should focus on democracy or on security in their various environmental measures. Should we focus on freedoms of expression, or should we focus on fighting terrorism or violence? That constrained analysis, I think, will give a better understanding of people's values on democracy, and that's what we do. We use various measures on that, and we subject that to an analysis that includes measures of the individual characteristics, the age, the education, gender, what have you, of the respondent, some variables that are country-specific, GDP per capita, oil dependency, etc., etc. And we also include Arab dummies, either country dummies or region dummies, that will enable us to look at the Arab exceptionalism per se. So given the time, I'm just going to jump in straight to showing you briefly a section of the results. First of all, if you do that exercise, you see some sort of a negative, a deficit, Arab deficit when it comes to values of democracy. Initially, it shows, and that deficit actually widens after wave 6 is basically the latest wave of the survey, which was done after the Arab Spring. So this deficit widens among the Arab world after the Arab Spring. However, it's unlikely to be driven by the Arab Spring, as itself, the effect itself after the Arab Spring, the extra deficit you get is small relative to the overall deficit. And previous work by Tesler shows that while there is a deficit that widens after the Arab Spring, it is not the main driver of it. Reassuringly, the other parameters are what we expect them to be. The youth tend to be more democratic, the educated tend to be more democratic, the middle class is the bastion of democracy, and this is again across 57 countries, some of them are Arab, 150 roughly 1,000 respondents. So this is a really rich data set that we're getting, and we find this negative democratic relationship in the values among Arab individuals. However, if we are to try to dissect what's driving this deficit, you can think about it along the lines of there are many effects that lead somebody to support or not support democratic values. We're going to be focusing on really, for the sake of the time today, I'm just going to show you the results of two of them that we focused on. The first one is, you can think of this, what Engelhardt and what's it called, the modernist aspiration, the self-expression, that is, as societies as individuals are more educated, a younger generation, they tend to move from a survivalist mode to more self-expression values, where they value more imagination, self-expression, critical values, creativity, and what have you. And then you can look at the other side on religious conservatism, and we measure it by basically the support that individuals have to religious authorities being the interpreter of the laws, and they go in the direction that you'd expect them to if we do just basic correlations, that more conservative individuals and countries tend to perform worse, actually to be negatively correlated with democratic value, and more modernist, if you may, or self-expressive societies tend to be positively correlated with society, the direction that we're used to. Now let's apply these two measures to the Arab world sample again. So what we do is we include dummy variables, interactions, for various individual effects against democracy. And I'll just bring to your attention a couple of things for the sake of time. The first one is, while globally the youth tend to be the champions of democracy, it's the reverse in the Arab world. The youth are actually negatively correlated when it comes to democracy, and that somehow can be partially explained by the gap or the stunting of the self-expression among the Arab youth. As you can see here, the older generations among the Arab world are more performing better on this modernist aspect compared to the rest of the world. So that drives the youth gap in support for democracy in the Arab.
It offsets.
It offsets, fair enough. You also see a very interesting negative effect between education among the Arab and democratic values. So for the rest of the world, more education tends to be more correlated with more support for democracy. It's actually the opposite in the Arab world. And that can be also explained by having more religious conservatism among the more educated in the Arab world. So the interesting thing is, if you control for these individual effects among Arabs, just these two individual effects among the Arab, notice what happens. The Arab exceptionalism deficit disappears. That is, while we find support for democratic Arab deficit in the data, in the values, once you control for individualistic aspects such as education, such as age, such as self-expression, what have you, the Arab exceptionalism disappears. That is, the Arab exceptionalism, not necessarily, if it exists, can be explained by culture. It's non-essentialist, it is individualist. There is something that we're not doing in our educational system that promotes democracy. It is not a missing Arab gene towards democracy as far as this data is showing. In the remainder of the time, I want to just pick an interesting aspect of the dynamic around support for Arab democracy around the Arab Spring. As Tolstoy says, there are many unhappy families are unhappy in their own ways. Let's pick one unhappy specific family. Let's look at what happened along the dynamics of why did the support for democracy drop in Egypt after the Arab Spring. So I'm going to show you just how did the support for democracy across different countries behave, starting with wave 4. Wave 4 was around the year 2000. And the outer line, this is the average for the rest of the world. So you can see that for all these Arab countries that we have, they're below the global average. You move to wave 5, that's the red line. You have an increase in support for democracy across these countries, yet it's still below the rest of the world. But watch what happens when we move. Wave 5, by the way, is in the year 2008, right before the Arab Spring. Notice what happens right after the Arab Spring. Democratic support in the Arab world collapses. Now, if we are to pick one of these countries, Egypt, and try to see along what lines there collapse, let's try to divide support for democracy across income lines. So if you divide support for democracy across income lines, this is the low-income class. Their support for democratic values more or less stable. For the middle-income group, it rises right before the Arab Spring and then falls right after the Arab Spring. But watch what happens to the higher-income group in Egypt. It crashes. It freaks out. The Islamists take over, the chaos, what have you, and they just freak out. Simultaneously, the support for strong leader, defined in the question as is, your support for a strong leader that leads without worrying or bothering, actually I think the language they use, bothering with parliament or legislative support. The support for it after the Arab Spring just jumps up across all various groups in Egypt. If you subject this and other factors to the econometric rigor and include other variables that could be of influence in addition to income, such as education, secular values, or what have you, we find that indeed between wave 5 and wave 6 for Egypt, there was a significant drop in support for Arab values, for democratic values. And that while the lowest income group in Egypt was actually against these democratic values right before the spring, and the democratic values were mostly supported by the upper income group in Egypt, that completely reverses after the spring. That is, you can think about it as the Arab Spring being initiated by these modernist values that wanted among the educated higher income, but then after the Arab Spring, the rich dropped out of the support, the lowest income jumped in and became the actual champions of supporting values, because they perhaps saw in it a chance to express their economic grievances and to improve their situation. The educated, while they continue to support it, they do it in a decreased fervor, if you may. And we do not have generational effects. It's not necessarily that it's the youth, as we saw before in the previous regressions, that are driving this push to democracy. So if you may, the modernizers initiated the Arab Spring, then they got cold feet right after that happened, and they pulled back. And now the support for these democratic values is driven by economic grievances agenda by the lowest income groups, while the upper income withdrew from the forum. I hope I'm not far off time, Ishaq. And that's it. Thank you.